What does it mean for the brave men and women who work in our intelligence services and their lives, how that will be affected? Let's turn to Sir John Sawyers, who's former chief of MI6 and was UK ambassador to the United Nations, now executive chairman of Newbridge Advisory. That's a firm he founded in 2019 to advise business leaders on geopolitics and political risks. Sir John, privileged to have you on the show. Thank you very much. That's the first question. How has COVID impacted the lives of the men and women brave enough to do those roles? Morning to you.
Morning. Well, it's made it very difficult because the business of intelligence involves being with people and meeting people, especially in difficult and dangerous places overseas. And of course, it's been much harder to travel. It's been harder to be in contact with our secret agents. And so it has made it more difficult. But it's also created some opportunities. Every country has been consumed by the coronavirus. And I think we've seen actually through the actions of China during the course of the last year, just the real nature of the Chinese system and the danger that it poses to us. So I think to that extent, it's revealed some things which we weren't fully perhaps aware of at top levels.
Got to push you a little bit on that, Sir John, if I might. The dangers of the Chinese system. Can I ask you to elaborate a bit?
I think over the last 10 years, we've seen China evolve in a direction where at home it's much more repressive. We've seen that in Hong Kong. We've seen it with the repression of the Uyghurs, attacks on building military power in the South China Sea and so on. And I think we've seen it during the course of the coronavirus, where they were very bad at cooperating with the World Health Organization initially. They sought to manipulate the control of personal protection equipment and so on. It's a difficult regime, a powerful regime. We can't contain it like we contain the Soviet Union. We have to compete and challenge it in various areas. And we have to do it as a unified West. And of course, that's been more difficult recently with President Trump in the White House. I think it should be easier now we have a Biden administration.
Why? What makes the incoming president, what makes that easier, do you imagine, Sir John?
It's because President Biden and his team believe that one of America's greatest strengths is its network of alliances with countries like Britain, in our Five Eyes partnership on intelligence, with Europe generally, with Japan and South Korea, and with India. As a Western alliance, an international alliance, we can take a common approach towards China and compete with it much more effectively than we can on our own. I mean, President Trump was right to call out China. He was the first American president really to challenge China, but he did it in a sort of characteristically sort of thrashing around way, and he didn't build on America's great strengths, which is its capacity to form international coalitions.
Should the British government be more robust in its relationship with China?
I think it is. I mean, I don't agree with everything that Boris Johnson's government has done, but I think, for example, Dominic Raab's decision to allow Hong Kong citizens to come to the UK, I think that's a very positive step. I think we're right to be wary of China buying up our tech companies, sending their students to investigate highly sensitive defence subjects at British universities. So we need to be tougher on these things. But, we are a bit on our own now. We have to work closely with the European Union and with the United States, as well as with our Asian partners, because we can't stand up to China on our own. We have to be part of an international grouping.
I'll come back to that in just a moment. Just to sort of conclude the Chinese conversation in a way, some people have suggested that it could have actually been some kind of laboratory accident. Can you rule that out? The position you once held, see it as a possibility, Sir John?
Well, I think it's been investigated by the WHO. I don't think it's a serious possibility. It looks as though this came from the rather disgusting habit the Chinese have of eating wild animals and buying them in markets. That seems to be where the virus has jumped from an animal species into a human. I don't think there's any evidence. It's a bit of a conspiracy theory to think it comes from a Chinese state lab.
Coming back to the idea of on our own, this obviously leads me to the conversation concerning Brexit. Has Brexit harmed UK national security?
I think the negotiators did a pretty good job of keeping us part of most of the systems that help our police and law enforcement. I think it's not so much the immediate issues that we face, although there are some European-wide databases that our police will now have more difficulty accessing. I think it's more that as a part of the European Union, Britain was able to shape and design key decisions that impact on our security, like the rules for transferring data, to make sure security concerns were there alongside privacy concerns, which were a bigger concern, for example, for the Germans. I think the European rules are now likely to shift in a direction over the years, unhelpful to the UK, and will be a rule taker rather than a rule maker. So that's the main area where our security has been damaged. It will be a longer term process rather than in the short term.
Ken McCallum, who you know who he is, just to tell my listeners, of course, is in charge of MI5. He's spoken of a toxic mix of threats, issues in Islamist extremism, Northern Ireland and the extreme right. Which is the biggest of those threats in your view, Sir John?
Well, I think of those, actually, I don't think any of them are the biggest threat we face. I think the biggest threat we face are from major state actors like China and Russia. But of those three that you mentioned, I think we still face a major challenge from Islamic terrorism. It hasn't gone away, as we've seen we saw in France last year, as we saw here a few years ago. And this rise of right-wing violence, which we saw in New Zealand a year or so ago, we've seen widely in America. I think that's a real concern, that right-wing groups feel that they can advance their agenda by organising activities like the insurrection in Washington last month.
You refer to them as state actors then, China and Russia. What is your fear of those countries such as those, and how are they to be combated?
Well, I think China is now on a par with the United States in terms of the size of its economy, but it has decided against having a system of openness and political debate inside China. It's much more focused on its own control and advancing its interests assertively abroad. And with Russia is is heavily dependent upon oil and gas revenues and so on, but it's a country which is not going to be a major world power in economic terms, but it still has major military power, as we've seen in Ukraine, and its ability to disrupt the West. Both countries think that by damaging the West through cyber attacks and by paying for political division in the West, that will advance their interests. And I think that's our biggest challenge, is keeping our political unity at home and keeping our alliances together.
Just a couple of last points. I have to ask you, running MI6, the men and women who served under you, was there a common denominator among them? Could you sort of tell something about them as they reported up to you? Incredibly brave people.
They are incredible people. I'm glad you asked me that, Nick, because more and more the people of MI6 and MI5, they reflect the society they serve. They are very varied, many women as well as men, many people from ethnic minorities, not enough, but an ever-increasing number. I think what they have in common is a commitment to public service and a loyalty to Britain as their country, and a determination to give up what could have been a higher profile, better earning job elsewhere to serve their country. And that essence of service, I think, is what runs through the intelligence community. And
so much of the work they do, we never even hear of. We don't even have the opportunity to thank them or to laud them in any way, because we don't even hear of it. And that's their skill, Sir John, of course.
That's our purpose. And I did find it disturbing, sitting as chief of MI6, seeing all the threats that people were plotting and the damage they were trying to do to Britain. And our job was to enable ordinary people in Britain to go about their lives without having to worry about those threats. And that's, I think, 99% of the time we achieve those goals. And we don't seek thanks, but occasional recognition, such as you've just given, Nick, I think is important, and it's encouraging to the men and women of the intelligence community.
It's an incredible job they do. Just the last couple of points. The world has moved on, of course, at a pace since you were there. We now have matters such as Facebook and WhatsApp. Sir John, you might have seen a story today. Facebook has been warned its privacy plans could make it a honeypot for child sex offenders after figures revealed encrypted WhatsApp service yields only 26 abuse tip-offs to law enforcement in a year. This could be a sort of closed area, not just in that field, but in all sorts of other fields.
Well, I agree with that. I think we spent the last 200 years, Nick, bringing order and regulation and a system of justice to the physical world. We now need to bring the same system to the virtual world. And big social media outlets like Facebook and Twitter, they need to recognize their responsibilities. They're doing that slowly, but technologies like theirs we all use it. It's all available for us to improve our lives, but it's also available for criminals and terrorists and paedophiles to use to advance their interests as well. We've got to maximize the benefits of these platforms, but control them and regulate them so that the people who are enemies of society can't use them to advance their own interests.
Last couple of questions. Sir John, later today we'll learn whether Shamima Begum will be allowed into this country to appeal the being stripped of her citizenship. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I take a view both in terms of justice and security. I think we're better off bringing people to justice in this country. Look, she was a stupid woman. She made bad decisions as a 15-year-old. She was probably used as she and her friends were used as a source of sex for ISIS fighters. But leaving her, dumping her on the Iraqis to provide justice, which they won't be able to do for someone who was born and brought up here in Britain and committed many of these crimes as a 15-year-old. Frankly, I think both justice, security and humanitarian concerns all come together, and she should come back here, face tough justice here. She shouldn't be soft-soaped. She should be denied a passport. She shouldn't be allowed to profit from her experiences, but she should face justice here rather than languish in a camp in the desert.
Lastly, I don't know if you've ever spoken of this. You may not actually be able to speak of this. It was reported this month that the murder of Gareth Williams, who, to remind my listeners, was, of course, working for MI6, could now be solved by using DNA from a hair found on his head after he was discovered locked in a bag some 11 years ago. How important for his family, for everybody, if this can be a breakthrough, is it that this is resolved? Sir John?
Well, this is it was a tragic story. I attended Gareth's funeral up in Anglesey with his family because, as you say, he was a member of the service. And there were one or two mistakes made at the time, but this was there was no evidence that this was as a result of who he worked for. And I think if the police can find can resolve this resolve this issue, then I think it will put everybody's minds at rest.